Revelation.
Welcome to Raw Revelation, where our custom is, if it died on the cross, we tag it and tow it. We stand on Hosea 4:6, because the warning was never to the world, it was to the priests.
Search the scriptures daily.
Get your notepads out, but this one's gonna be deep.
When you join a church, you're making a massive investment. You give up your weekends, tithe a percentage of your income, and trust a leadership team with the spiritual development of your family. But a very real problem arises when you try to figure out who you're actually trusting. It is incredibly difficult to tell the difference between a genuinely healthy spiritual shepherd and a corporate CEO running an unchecked organization. Most of us default to evaluating a church based on how it feels. We look at the production quality of the worship, the polish of the marketing, and how charismatic the pastor is on stage. To get a reliable read on an organization, strip away religious jargon and examine the underlying structure. Evaluating purely on personality and stage presence ignores actual governance. Health requires a structure built on peer review and rigorous accountability. Relying on an emotional connection while ignoring how power is distributed leaves you completely vulnerable. When a crisis hits, good vibes will not protect you from a toxic power structure. We start by looking at observable behavior. A pastor's daily conduct reveals whether they operate as a shepherd caring for a flock or a performer managing an audience. The clearest indicator is how power is handled. A shepherd operates within a system of shared consensus. A performer requires absolute solo authority. You also see this when leadership is challenged. Healthy leadership patiently engages with difficult questions. Unhealthy leadership gets defensive and labels those exact same questions as rebellion. Then there is the issue of access. Performers intentionally isolate themselves to protect their status, delaying meetings indefinitely. Shepherds actually know the people they lead. Scripture expects you to question what you are taught. The biblical precedent in Acts 17 praises congregation members who verify the truth of a sermon, rather than blindly submitting to it. A solo-led model cannot survive that level of scrutiny. To maintain absolute control over the organization's narrative, the leader has to suppress anyone trying to verify their teachings. When a pastor shuts down doctrinal questions or makes themselves inaccessible, it is a deliberate, structural mechanism of domination. It sacrifices the spiritual safety of the congregation just to keep the organization moving. That mechanism of control directly impacts two highly sensitive areas: how the leadership handles biblical truth and how they collect your money. The baseline expectation for a pastor is to provide accurate context for Scripture and to correct errors clearly without getting defensive. A major warning sign is when a leader builds messages on isolated verses, using heightened emotion to override factual context. This manipulation usually peaks when the offering buckets are passed. You will see specific language pressuring you to sow a seed to receive your blessing, often paired with tiered giving demands. Tying financial giving directly to spiritual blessings violates clear scriptural warnings against leaders being motivated by dishonest gain. When doctrinal twisting and financial pressure operate together, they create a culture of extraction. The leadership uses the pulpit to bleed the congregation's resources. If a church's financial model relies on pressure and manipulated blessings, the organization exists to serve the platform. It does not exist to shepherd the people. All of these abuses stem from an architecture built entirely on the moral perfection of one individual. A solo visionary model creates a mathematically unstable organization. It builds in a catastrophic single point of failure. The primary structural boundary that prevents this in a safe church is called plural leadership. Plural leadership is a system of shared authority. Peers hold each other accountable, and no single man sits unchecked at the top of the org chart. But claiming you have accountability means nothing if there isn't a formal, actionable mechanism to enforce discipline when a leader steps out of line. 1 Timothy 5 outlines a specific, formal correction process designed to protect the congregation from abusive leaders. Step 1 requires any accusation against a leader to be confirmed by multiple witnesses. This prevents frivolous or vindictive attacks. Step 2 is the peer review phase. Equal authority leaders actively examine the evidence and review the leader's doctrine. Step 3 is the mandate for public rebuke if the accusation is confirmed. The leader is not quietly shielded or reassigned. This process demands uncomfortable public transparency. There is no way around that trade-off, but it is the only reliable way to prevent systematic abuse. An organization lacking a formal, peer-driven correction process is unstable by design. When the solo leader eventually makes a serious error, the resulting fallout will damage the congregation. Unbiblical leadership is intentionally isolated, protected, and unquestionable. Authentic biblical leadership is structurally shared, continuously examined, and rigorously accountable. You can use those realities to audit an organization. Look for these 5 warning signs: no equal authority peers, no formal correction system, avoiding doctrinal questions, inaccessible leadership, and an environment driven by financial pressure. If you are currently evaluating a new church, verify these structural elements before you invest your first dime or dedicate your weekends to their programs. If you find that the structure is isolated and solo-led, the safest decision you can make is to walk away immediately. For those of you feeling uneasy with a controlling or unapproachable pastor, your concern is structurally justified. It is not a sign of your own rebellion. If a leader claims to be above correction, the defect lies in the organization's design, not in your faith. If you are a lay leader serving on a board, you need to push through the friction. Advocate for transitioning your governance board to true plural accountability, even if it upsets the status quo. True spiritual safety requires sacrificing the momentum of absolute control. You have to trade that speed for a transparent, accountable structure that genuinely protects the flock. Look at the modern megachurch landscape. Massive auditoriums, millions of dollars in broadcast equipment, a single voice amplified to reach thousands at once. But underneath all that volume is a profound silence. If a person's entire profession is built on teaching the truth, why would they refuse to answer direct questions about it? Imagine you do exactly what you are told. You open the text, you study the teachings, you compare what is being broadcast from the stage with the actual scripture in your hands, and you find a discrepancy. You don't run to social media to cause a public scene. You follow the proper protocol. You ask for a formal, private meeting to get clarity. But that request is met with indefinite delays. The delays turn into total silence. And eventually, the leadership labels your private concern as division. When a leader demands an audience but refuses a conversation, they are no longer protecting the truth. They are protecting their position. Let's strip away the emotion and look at this objectively. If we view this ancient document as a foundational operating charter, complete with specific mandates, a very clear picture emerges. 1 Peter chapter 5 verse 2 outlines the core job description. It mandates leaders to actively shepherd the flock, which requires close proximity and direct engagement. 2 Timothy chapter 2 adds specific performance metrics. It requires leaders to be patient and explicitly demands the ability to teach and correct those who have questions. We can track this standard all the way back to Nehemiah chapter 8, where leaders were required to read the text and clearly explain the meaning so the public could fully understand it. According to this blueprint, leadership is inherently interactive. A true shepherd engages, explains, and answers. The charter never authorized a one-way broadcast. This diagram illustrates a healthy feedback loop. The original designers built a structural fail-safe into the organization to prevent any single individual from becoming an untouchable apex predator. It is a concept called plurality. The texts of Titus chapter 1 and Acts chapter 14 mandated multiple elders in every location. Power was distributed across a cluster of leaders to maintain strict accountability. We have a historical record of this fail-safe working perfectly. The Apostle Paul openly corrected the Apostle Peter. Even the highest-ranking figures in the early church were subject to an audit. Now, look at the operational reality of today's isolated leader. those lines of accountability are severed. Questions go unread. Meetings are delayed. The leader retreats behind a wall. To maintain this isolation, the leadership weaponizes vocabulary. Any legitimate inquiry from the congregation is quickly labeled as division, which effectively shuts down the feedback loop completely. When a system is intentionally stripped of its feedback loops and closed off from open correction, it ceases to be biblical leadership. It operates as an artificial control mechanism. A leader who retreats behind this kind of artificial barrier, who refuses to meet and be examined, is actively protecting their control over the organization. If you've ever been alienated or dismissed simply for asking questions, you need to hear this. You are not crazy, and you are not the problem. By seeking clarity, you are fulfilling the mandate of the original blueprint. You are doing exactly what the text instructs you to do. Test it, examine it, and verify the teaching. So here is the direct challenge to the untouchable leader. If you teach the text publicly, you must be willing to defend your teaching publicly. That defense cannot rely on emotional manipulation or political maneuvering. It must be grounded entirely in the text itself, through an open and honest conversation. Truth never collapses under the weight of an audit. A genuine shepherd understands this, and because of that, they will always welcome the test. You are sitting in the front row. The speaker is teaching something demonstrably false, and you say absolutely nothing. It is easy to convince yourself that staying quiet is the wise move, that keeping your mouth shut protects the group's unity and avoids unnecessary drama. But look closer at that decision. Is withholding the truth an act of peacemaking, or are you harboring a dangerous threat? In the specific context of spiritual leadership, ignoring an error isn't passive. It is a definitive, conscious choice that carries heavy accountability. Ezekiel's watchman principle makes the leader an early warning system. When a threat approaches, the watchman flashes an alert. Titus shares this standard. Leaders must actively refute false teaching. Without the warning flash, the threat bypasses the silent watchman entirely, infiltrating and compromising the surrounding nodes. A shepherd is hired for protection. When they refuse to sound the alarm, they break their contract and fail the core duty of their job. So if a leader knows the standard, why do they stay quiet? The answer usually comes down to an internal calculation. First, they measure their position. Speaking truth directly to whoever holds power immediately threatens their own seat at the table, and often their livelihood. Next, they calculate access. Confronting a peer or a superior means risking social capital, stepping out of the inner circle, and losing relevance. Finally, there is comfort. Human beings naturally avoid the intense, messy friction and the inevitable professional fallout that comes with looking someone in the eye and calling them wrong. Leaders will often claim they are simply protecting unity by keeping the peace. In reality, maintaining the status quo in the face of deception is a smokescreen for self-preservation. When a leader decides that their personal access and comfort outweigh the necessity of the truth, they have committed institutional compromise. This internal compromise causes external fallout. Uncorrected error does not sit still. It is never a static, harmless object. This graph shows truth as a solid white line. False teaching, as in 2 Peter, diverges at a tiny 1-degree angle. The gap widens into a chasm. Data points representing people follow this path, moving steadily off course over time. This trajectory has an inevitable end state. It creates a scenario of the blind leading the blind, where a community follows unchecked deception straight into a ditch. By trying to keep everyone comfortable and avoiding conflict today, the silent leader guarantees systemic failure and massive collateral damage to the entire community tomorrow. There is a strict rule of spiritual liability here, though. The leader who compromised is not the only one on the hook. The Book of Acts presents a balancing mechanism, the absolute requirement for the audience to examine everything for themselves. Liability is sharply divided. Those in authority will answer for what they allowed to be taught, but the people sitting in the seats will answer for what they chose to accept. A corrupt or silent leadership team does not grant the congregation a free pass to play the victim. Recognizing the truth is a shared responsibility. Think back to that seat in the front row. You are watching the error unfold in real time. If you know the facts but sit on them to protect your own seat, you have abdicated your role. You are no longer a shepherd. You are a politician. The actual baseline of shepherding requires stepping forward and sounding the alarm when threats approach. A genuine shepherd warns the flock. They deliver the truth, especially when it costs them their position, their access, and their comfort. If you want to become a recognized preacher today, you are expected to navigate a strict gauntlet of institutional checkpoints. This pipeline usually involves years of formal seminary education, followed by rigorous theological examinations administered by a denominational board. The entire process builds toward the highest formal endorsement a modern church can grant: ordination. Look at the heavy hierarchy arrayed here. This structure enforces a tight barrier to entry, requiring peer approval before anyone is allowed to step into the pulpit. Modern evangelical spaces use similar peer endorsement models to validate leaders. Notice the academic regalia, the layered hoods and stoles. These garments physically symbolize specialized intellectual training. Audiences naturally use these credentials to calibrate the authority of the speaker. A specialized degree or an official title provides immediate assumed competence. The modern baseline for pastoral authority rests on academic achievement and institutional approval, rather than observable, functional, or moral data. When we shift our investigation back to the primary dataset, the ancient manuscripts of the New Testament, we find a starkly different framework. Scanning the text for mentions of seminary degrees, ordination licenses, or institutional board approvals returns a complete null set. They simply do not exist in the source material. The biblical texts outline a functionally driven model that prioritizes character, completely bypassing modern credentialing structures. We can build a comparative matrix to map this divergence. On the left, we track the textual mandate, and on the right, the later institutional mandate. We will isolate the pure textual requirements first, contrasting them directly against centuries of institutional additions. To understand what a preacher is actually required to be, we have to strip away the bureaucracy and identify the bare functional core. Romans 10 establishes a strict chronological starting point for anyone who teaches. It asks, how shall they preach unless they are sent? The first component is the calling. This operates as a divine initiative rather than a personal career choice. This two-step sequence means preaching is an inherently commissioned act. It is not an independent venture. This conflicts directly with the modern practice, where individuals bypass local church endorsement entirely to build independent digital platforms. A self-appointed platform severs the sending requirement outlined in the epistles, creating a profound structural error. Biblical authority must be externally verified by a community. It cannot be exclusively felt or declared by the individual. The authority to speak does not originate from a desire to be heard. It is granted through verifiable external sending. Once commissioned, the texts of 1 Timothy and Titus provide dense, non-negotiable behavioral lists for anyone stepping into leadership. These require specific behavioral markers: strict self-control, relational fidelity, and spiritual maturity. A key indicator is proven household management. Private faithfulness validates public authority. The texts also issue strict disqualifiers. Documented greed, arrogance, or violence immediately revokes the right to lead. The text summarizes this standard as being blameless. This means the strict absence of any pattern of scandal that could harm the community, not sinless perfection. The explicit prohibition against new converts ensures that spiritual maturity takes time. Raw speaking skill and charisma cannot bypass the need for a tested track record. Scanning these extensive lists for any mention of a required degree or formal license returns nothing. The text ignores academic pedigree entirely. Yet later church hierarchies adopted elaborate titles, robes, and ornaments to project authority, the exact external markers the primary texts omitted. The biblical barrier to entry is entirely behavioral. Sustaining a lifetime of integrity requires far more rigor than passing academic exams. This character-first model creates a standard accessible to any faithful believer, yet totally impossible for the unprincipled to maintain. Beyond character, the preacher's primary responsibility is handling truth. 2 Timothy sets the functional baseline. The speaker must rightly divide the word of truth. This is a technical requirement for exegesis. drawing the actual meaning out of the text, rather than slipping into motivational eisegesis, where personal ideas are forced into the scripture. Titus adds that a teacher must hold firm enough to not only exhort the congregation, but to actively refute false doctrine. Because of this doctrinal responsibility, James chapter 3 introduces the concept of stricter judgment for anyone who assumes the teaching office. This severe liability reframes the pulpit. It is not a platform for self-promotion. It is a position of immense structural risk. This weight is exactly why spiritual maturity and a strict devotion to prayer are non-negotiable foundations for the role. The teaching office is designed as a heavy burden of truth handling, strictly reserved for those functionally and morally precise enough to bear the judgment. Here we see the full comparative matrix. The textual mandate column is complete, populated exclusively with character, doctrinal precision, and calling. Now we drop in the modern requirements: theology degrees, ordination papers, and institutional licensing. These institutional filters are highly useful for establishing basic educational standards and providing legal protection within a denomination. However, relative to the source text, these must be categorized as helpful but non-binding additions. The danger is institutional drift. This occurs when these secondary academic filters begin to completely supersede the primary behavioral mandates. A modern institution can certainly endorse a preacher, but it lacks the capacity to biblically qualify one. To accurately assess leadership, congregations must recalibrate and return to the primacy of the behavioral dataset. Confusing an academic degree for spiritual maturity corrupts the evaluation of church leadership. This graph models the collision in the real world, mapping platform size against biblical qualification. The bottom right quadrant reveals the false positive, an individual boasting a massive audience and formal titles, yet biblically disqualified by a lack of character. Physical elevation and institutional backing mask this lack of qualification. The literal distance from the congregation creates an illusion of authority, independent of moral data. Conversely, the top left quadrant represents the qualified unknown, an individual with zero institutional credentials or platform who perfectly executes every strict standard in the New Testament. True authority does not emanate from the speaker. It resides entirely in the speaker's faithfulness to the text itself. The standard remains fixed: verified character, rigorous doctrinal precision, and an external divine commission. Institutions can certainly support this biblical model, but no amount of modern credentialing can ever artificially manufacture it.
We stand on Hosea 4:6 because the warning was never to the world, it was to the priests.